Eastern on C-SPAN's Q&A.
Washington Journal continues.
This is Representative Rob Woodall, Republican of Georgia, a member of the Budget Committee, also a member of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Pedro.
When it comes to the president's released budget, what do you think it says about his thinking about spending?
Well, it shows that he's aware of the challenges we have going forward. You'll remember last year he produced a budget that came to balance. This year, the budget he produced, similar economic assumptions, can't get to balance. That's the impact of waiting on those tax cuts to begin to generate more economic revenue. And it's a reflection of the challenges we have, both on the discretionary spending side and the entitlement side.
You've seen the analysis of the budget, which is a blueprint, potentially $7 trillion in deficits resulting of that. What do you think of that figure? And is that a concern for fiscal conservatives?
Well, of course it's a concern. And I think the thing that folks have to remember is the president's budget isn't binding. I sit on the Budget Committee. We're going to write our own budget on Capitol Hill. Even Capitol Hill budgets are not binding. However, it's all just a roadmap of how to get from here to there. So what's interesting in the president's budget to me, number one, is his commitment to transportation. He said he would be focused on transportation, and he is. Another thing that's interesting to me is he said he wouldn't touch Social Security or Medicare. Now, I'm in my 40s. I think we ought to start talking about renegotiating the contract with people in their 40s because we know the dollars aren't going to be there. The president said he wouldn't touch it. He didn't touch it. And so watching a president actually follow through on his campaign promises, even when the news is bad, it's good news that he's trying to do what he told the American people he would do.
Aren't there calls for cuts to Medicare and Medicaid as part of this package?
Well, the Medicaid has always been in a different category. Of course, no one has ever paid a nickel into a Medicaid trust fund to protect them. We've all paid our dollars in every single paycheck, our entire lifetime, into the Medicare system. So I put those in different categories. But the Medicaid system is in trouble. And what the president tries to do is the same thing we've tried to do on the House side, which is provide the authority to states to flexibly do those plans. A plan that works in New York City isn't going to work in my home state of Georgia in our rural areas. We need to have more flexibility for states. I don't think anybody cares more about the citizens of Georgia than the governor of Georgia does. I think that's true for 49 other states as well.
And Medicare?
Medicare is one of those programs that we can say that we care about it, but if we care about it, we have to invest in it and protect it. Medicare can only be protected by providing consumers with choice. The one-size-fits-all model that worked in '65 isn't going to work today, and we know the Medicare Trust Fund cannot survive beyond 2029 under the current assumptions, under current policy. If you've been paying into Medicare your entire life and you're going to start to qualify for those benefits 10 years from now, you want to know why Congress can't find a solution moving forward. We've proposed those in the House. We've passed those in the House budget. Senate hasn't been able to do that. White House hasn't decided to take on that challenge
We've
yet.
seen more spending come from the passage of the tax cut. We've seen more spending come from the passage of the Senate, $300 billion in raising of caps. That's a lot of spending. Is the age of fiscal conservatism over?
It is not. The age of gridlock may be over, however, and that was the challenge we saw with that spending deal and the $300 billion there. The whole point of the Budget Control Act, which capped spending, was to say you need to deal with the big issues like Medicaid, like Medicare, like Social Security, make sure those programs are solvent going into the future. Congress hasn't been able to muster the votes. Again, I voted for those budgets every single year. We've never been able to get one through the Senate. We've never had a White House take on that challenge. If anything, the age of fiscal conservatism is right upon us today. We cannot sustain deficits of this magnitude going forward. I voted against a disaster bill, for example, because when our neighbors are hurting, the honorable thing to do is to dig into your pocket to help your neighbors, not to dig into your children's pocket or your grandchildren's pocket to help your neighbors. We're going to have more of that discussion going forward. Tax cuts in the same category. A tax cut that produces a deficit isn't a tax cut. It's a delayed tax because one day that bill is going to come due, and we're going to be grappling with that together.
If you want to ask our guest questions, it's 202-748-8001 for Republicans, Democrats 202-748-8000, and Independents 202-748-8002. And you can also tweet us at C-SPAN WJ. Is it fair to say that some of the savings produced out of this budget will come at the expense of social safety net programs?
Well, I think the social safety net programs are broken. I talk to constituents all the time who have access to food stamps, for example, but what they need is housing assistance. They have access to housing assistance, but what they need is transportation assistance. The point of our social safety net is to catch folks and then lift them back up again. Are there savings to be had by putting people back to work? There are. And as you know, Pedro, the workforce participation rate today, historically low. There's a help wanted sign in every storefront that you and I pass, and yet we can't find jobs for those Americans. Workforce redevelopment combined with those social safety net reforms, it's going to put more people back to work. It's going to provide more value to the American citizen.
Some of those programs, though, were on the chopping block for the president when it comes to retraining programs and jobs programs?
Well, he's certainly looking to see what's effective. And I would encourage you to look at what our Education and Workforce Committee is doing. Virginia Fox out of North Carolina is the chairwoman of that committee. They've gone through year after year consolidating scores of programs down into 2 or 3 that are going to be more effective, more efficient, both for taxpayers and for those folks looking for workforce redevelopment. But no, I see a commitment from this White House for workforce redevelopment. I certainly see that commitment in the U.S. House, and I see it at the state and local levels in Georgia as well.
When it comes to programs like SNAP, one of the things that came out yesterday was the idea of developing food boxes to supplement payments. What do you think about, that as an innovative way of looking at these problems, and what do you think the reception is going to be?
Well, the reception I expect to be poor, because this isn't a town that embraces new ideas and risks. This is a town that poo-poos everything. Certainly if it comes out of this White House, it gets poo-pooed aggressively.
But that's something you could buy into then, this idea?
Well, this isn't a new idea. This idea came out 4 decades ago. We talked about this in the 1960s. What would it mean to hunger in this country if we had places that folks could go and have access to all of those staples? That's what the American people want. That's what we're trying to do with our big hearts and our open wallets in terms of helping our neighbors who are in need. Is the food stamp program subject to fraud and abuse today? You know that it is. So in an effort to do better, I'm glad we're talking about these ideas. Whether it makes it across the finish line, it didn't 40 years ago. It might not here today, but I'm glad we're talking about new ideas.
Rob Woodall, our guest, he's on the Budget Committee, also on the Infrastructure and Transportation Committee. We'll talk about that in a bit, but questions for you first from Ron. Ron is in Florida. Democrats line, you're on with our guest. Good morning, go ahead.
Good morning, Representative.
Good morning,
I'm just
Ron.
wondering why it's taken so long. The first thing that they did with President Obama was say that they weren't going to do anything. You guys didn't do anything for 8 years. And as a conservative, progressive, and I'm a pretty religious guy, I don't know why it would take you people this long to take and come together. And now you're spending money, my money, just like a drunken sailor. And being a Marine, I've seen a few drunken sailors in my lifetime. And you're just going on and on and on, and you have no fiscal responsibility whatsoever. And if there's so much fraud and abuse, why don't you just stop and get rid of that?
Okay, caller, thanks.
Ron, a couple of answers to that. I'm relatively new in Congress, been here 6 years. You've seen not millions, not billions, but trillions of dollars cut from the budgets in those years that I've been in Congress. And I'm not talking about budgets that are non-binding. Those have certainly cut trillions. I'm talking about if you go back and look at what America was expected to spend when this new class of Republicans came in 2011, and what we've actually spent today, it's $1 trillion less today. So I want you to know that commitment to fiscal conservatism is alive and well. But if you go back to 1990s and look at what Newt Gingrich and Bill Clinton did together, they didn't balance the budget by historic cuts. They balanced the budget because they had historic tax revenues coming in. Finding agreement on spending other people's money is the easy thing to do. Finding agreement on cutting programs, that's the hard thing to do, and that's why you see some of the discord that you do.
Illinois is next. Ray on our independent line.
Hello, good morning.
Good morning, Ray.
Yes, I was just wondering why there is a cap on Social Security, because we're worried about it running out. So why is there a cap, and how do we remove it?
Ray, are you thinking about the cap on earnings on Social Security?
Yes.
That cap that Ray is talking about is the one that says if you're paying into Social Security, you only have to pay Social Security taxes on your first about $120,000 of earnings. The reason that cap's there, Ray, is because how much you can get back from Social Security is also capped. We could raise the caps on how much you're paying in, but that would also raise the amount of money that's going out the door. When we have those conversations about how to make sure Social Security is solvent for the next generation, raising the caps is always part of that discussion. And then the question is, do we continue to raise benefits as we raise the amount of taxes people are paying in, or for the first time in Social Security's history, do we raise taxes on workers and not raise their benefits at the same time? Those are hard questions for folks to answer, but you're right on target. Of the four major pillars of Social Security reform, raising the caps would be one.
Phyllis is in Kansas City, Democrats line.
Yes, here's what they say Social Security, and we paid into that, and Medicare, we paid into that too, and it was supposed to be, Social Security was supposed to be in a trust fund. But you notice that whenever they want to fund like 20 million people that doesn't have insurance, they dig the money out of Medicare and Social Security so that they can give illegals free benefits, education, medical. I mean, so really, it's their fault that our country's in this mess.
Phyllis, there's certainly lots of legitimate complaints in this town. I try to do my best to focus on those and dispel the ones that just aren't true. Every penny that's been paid in the Social Security Trust Fund is in the Social Security Trust Fund. We just promised people more money in benefits than we ever collected in taxes. It was true when the Democrats and Republicans had to come together in 1983 to reorganize the Social Security Trust Fund, and it's true today. Medicare, same thing is true. You don't get Medicare unless you have paid into it your entire life. But one of the things that I didn't realize until I got to Congress is those dollars you and I have paid our entire lives, that was only for Medicare Part A. If you have Medicare Part B for your physician, as 98% of Americans do, you've never paid a penny in taxes for that, nor have I. That just comes out of general revenues of the taxpayer. Same thing with Medicare Part D. There are no trust funds for Medicare Part D. That just comes right out of the federal treasury plus the premium that you paid. So be confident that those trust fund dollars, they are in those trust funds. There are government bonds in that trust fund, but those dollars are there. It's just simply not enough for all the expenses going out the door.
Representative Woodall, the president's approach to the economy is banked on this idea of growth in our country. And there's a story in the Washington Post this morning that takes a look at this idea of a 3% growth as a possibility. Right. Economists in the story highlighted the fact that that's not a realistic goal, especially over the long term. First of all, do you think it's realistic? And if so, why?
Well, historically, it's a lot more common than what we've seen of late. CBO has said 1.9% growth. Private economists have said 2.1%, 2.2% growth over the long term. If we'd had an additional 1% growth during the Obama years, the budget would be balanced today. Growth really does have a dividend, not just a quality of life dividend, but a federal books dividend. Are we on our way closer to 3 than we have been in years past? We absolutely are. Is the House Budget Committee going to use a 3% growth rate? We're not. I do think that's optimistic. But I think the American people voted for this president because he does have that optimism about America. I'm a conservative. I'm going to be a little more conservative in my estimates. I'm going to count on the White House to share that optimism.
So when it comes to the committee itself, what's the rate of growth that you guys are banking on when you're making your projections?
Well, we're just getting into that conversation. The CBO is going to come out with its new score a little later this month. We'll see where it is. Last year, we thought the CBO was a little a little too pessimistic about where we were going to be. I think that the economic data has shown that to be true. So I'm expecting us to have a little bit higher number this year, a little more economic growth.
Is there a danger then from the president banking what he wants to do with the economy on this possibility of growth?
Well, to be fair, the president has said, I still can't get to balance even with this growth. So he understands that if he wants to reshape the economy, bring more Americans back into the workforce, make the American worker the most productive on the planet, it's going to take some time to do. We didn't anticipate the rate of growth we got in the 90s, and we are optimistic we can get back to those growths today. It's going to take productivity changes, Pedro. We've got to get folks back into the workforce. We've got to have some big productivity changes. You see that in the president's transportation budget as he's promoting those transformative, innovative projects, well, really for the first time in my lifetime.
Is it realistic for a state to possibly have to consider coming up with all this money in order to gain access to these larger pot of money that the president offers?
Well, it absolutely is. I mean, that's the great fiction here, that the federal government has all this money and states don't. We all get our money from the same place, and that's the American citizen. Whether the state of Georgia taxes me or the federal government taxes me, I'm still the one paying the bills as the taxpayer. You're still the one paying the bills. In Georgia, we've stepped up in that way. We passed a new transportation bill, bringing in an additional $1 billion worth of revenue. Now, put that in perspective. The president's put down a $20 billion down payment for the entire nation for the year. Georgia's put together $1 billion by itself. States absolutely can do this, and truthfully, citizens in the state of Georgia trust their local and state governments more than they trust Washington.
Where does this federal money come from, this pool? Where does this projected money come from?
Well, we're going to have to talk about revenue streams. The gas tax hasn't been raised since 1993, and that's the dominant federal source of transportation revenue, 18.4 cents a gallon. Obviously, that's been degraded by inflation since 93. Whether we're talking about vehicle miles traveled taxes, whether we're talking about fuel taxes, whether we're talking about carbon taxes, whatever you want to discuss, if you want new infrastructure, we have to have a revenue stream to pay for it. What the president has said is, Americans haven't been getting $1's worth of value out of $1's worth of transportation taxes. He's going to change the regulatory environment so you and I can get $1's worth of value. That's going to make a big difference when I have to go home and have that revenue conversation with my constituents.
Back to the taxes. Is that something you can agree with, a slight raising of taxes on those fronts in order to pay for these things?
My experience with folks back home in Georgia is folks are willing to pay for those things that they want. They just don't want to throw money down a rat hole, which is what people think they're doing when they send their dollars to Washington, D.C. We've had an incredibly positive response in the great state of Georgia to ballot initiatives to raise transportation dollars when you know those dollars are going to get plowed immediately into high-impact projects back home.
The president is set to meet with a group of legislators on this idea of transportation. Are you one of them, and what's the goal of this meeting?
I'm not. We're going to have our transportation committee chairman there, and it's to find that sweet spot of agreement. We can have a discussion and produce a great product in the House. They can produce a great product in the Senate, and the White House can want something entirely different. That's not going to get America where America needs to be. Having these negotiations early, getting on the same page early, is producing a tax bill for the first time in a generation, produced a budget agreement for the first time in several years. It's going to produce a major transportation program for the first time in a decade as well.
Our guest serves on the Budget and Transportation Infrastructure Committee. He also served as the Chief of Staff to former Representative John Linder for 16 years on Capitol Hill. Silver Spring, Maryland, Democrats line. Joe, thanks for waiting. Go ahead.
Yes, good morning.
Good morning, Joe.
Congressman and Pedro there. I'm concerned with, you talked about the federal treasury and government money and so forth, but in all fairness, you did mention that money comes from American citizens. That's my comment, but my question is, what impact do you think that, if any, outsourcing has on the growth, on our possibility to grow? I mean, we are sending jobs of telephone service. You know, I pick up my telephone, I call the bank, and there's someone from another country. Now, I know that some of the digital jobs, Americans have made the transition to do those, but clearly a lot of the jobs that are being sent overseas affect growth in America. Now, do you think that we can do anything to temper outsourcing from major corporations, or is that something that Congress can't touch? Thank you.
Thank you, caller.
Joe, I think we can absolutely make an impact there. In fact, we have with this tax bill. You've seen facilities that were going to move overseas say they're now going to stay in America. You've seen facilities say they have been overseas. They're now going to come back to America. We have to make it easy for the American worker to be the most productive worker in the world. Now, will there always be some low-skilled jobs that are going to be easier to outsource than to do in this country? There are, but that doesn't mean we have to give up on the entire economy as a result. For example, when we're talking about high-skilled workers in the computer programming field, we can either have that work done here, we can have the management team stay here, but the work done overseas, or we can have the whole project move overseas. There are gradations in what gets outsourced, and the more we can keep here, the better off we're going to be. That begins with making the American worker as competitive as he and she can be, not with rules that prevent outsourcing, but with rules that make outsourcing unnecessary.
We'll hear from Susan, Kissimmee, Florida, Republican line.
Hi. Usually with budgets, the money is always pocketed up front with lobbyists and contractors, and nothing gets done. Is there a way that you can bring in private contractors like Elon Musk to build the wall and roads? I don't think anything is going to be done. In fact, because of going to contractors and defense contractors, I would say heavily invest in General Dynamics, Raytheon. I just don't see anything being done. I have to say, you seem very trustworthy, but like everything, nothing will get done. We've had roads here in Kissimmee and John Young Parkway that have been under construction for over 2 years, and all it is 4 blocks. From Hurricane Irma, we still have limbs, potholes all over the place, but everybody seems to be concerned with DACA and the Puerto Ricans, Maria, but nobody seems to be concerned about, something that's we need desperately. We need to fix the roads.
Gotcha, caller. Gotcha. Thank you.
Susan, let me give you some great hope. $81 billion was a part of the bill the president signed last week to deal with the fallout from Irma. We've had 3 tranches of those dollars already, but those dollars are coming to Florida soon to help with that. You're absolutely right about the distrust folks have, particularly in transportation projects. I have a project in my district, 2.5 miles of road. We've been working on it for more than 12 years. Folks are fed up with those kinds of delays. But it's not the contractor itself. It's some of the regulatory framework that goes on there. When we had a bridge collapse in downtown Atlanta late last year, we put up 3 spans of highway in 6 weeks. It was the fastest transportation project we'd ever had in the state. It's now a national model about how to get things done. Look for that in the president's transportation proposal. He wants to make those projects faster, and he absolutely, in fact, he mentions Elon Musk and the Hyperloop in his transportation plan. He absolutely wants to make those dollars available and make a regulatory framework possible for those innovators outside of government to succeed. About $20 billion in the president's transportation budget dedicated to those kinds of innovative, transformative projects that'll shape the world differently tomorrow than you and I knew it yesterday.
$200 billion of federal seed money as part of the president's plan for infrastructure would create, according to him, $1.5 trillion of total spending on infrastructure over 10 years. Half of those funds would go to an incentive program to match financing from state and local governments interested in rebuilding projects. There's a story in the Wall Street Journal about private equity funds and how they're looking at this effort. Let me just read you a couple lines from it this morning, saying that fund managers say they are mainly looking for assets that are already privately owned, such as renewable energy, railroads, utilities, and pipelines, and not the deteriorating government-owned infrastructures like road and bridges that help attract capital in the first place. Is that a concern overall, looking at this idea of a transportation fund?
Well, anytime you put together a large pot of money, smart people are going to look at it and try to see how they can game the system. That's my job, to make sure folks can't game that system. But I do think it's fair that the president wants to reflect that those communities that have done a good job with their transportation assets, communities like Georgia that have raised their own taxes to preserve those assets, we don't want to just focus transportation dollars on those dilapidated assets. There is a stewardship responsibility that communities have to take care of their assets. We want to reward those communities where we know assets are being taken care of, at the same time that we try to revitalize those communities where those assets have fallen into disrepair.
Debbie, in New Mexico, Independent Line.
Hi, good morning. I don't even know where to begin listening to you. It just blows my mind. You're talking about you can't raise the cap on Social Security because you'll have to raise the money. I don't agree with that. There's a cap on unemployment. As far as immigration, you guys did a little experiment in 2012, if I'm not mistaken, and got most of the immigrants out of your state, and the farmers lost 40% of their crops. So now you want to do countrywide with immigration? And come on, be truthful. 60% of the people who come here, they come by airplane. They don't come over the wall. I think you're being disingenuous to all the people who are listening, and I'll take your comment offline. Thank you very much.
Well, Debbie, I prefer affirmation to constructive criticism, but I welcome the constructive criticism as well. Truth is, Georgia has the largest and busiest airport in the country, so I'm absolutely focused on folks who are coming in and out that way. But you make a great point about agriculture. Anytime I have an immigration conversation with folks back home, I ask that question. Are you raising your son or daughter to be the very best carrot picker that Georgia has ever seen? Because if you're not raising your son and daughter to be that carrot picker, and if you're not trying to get a patent on a new carrot picking machine, we need to be able to get carrots out of the field, and we need a successful immigration program that allows folks to get a visa, to come to the country, to do the work that we need to be done. There is absolutely a disconnect between what people say about immigration and what they say about what they want in their grocery stores, and that's one that I think we can dispel some of those misconceptions. We can bring folks together on a package that will solve both of those problems.
There's a report this morning that the House leaders will whip Mr. Goodlatte's immigration bill. If you can, give a summary of it, and it's something you can support.
It is something I can support. What Chairman Goodlatte has done through the Judiciary Committee is to say, let's take care of DACA kids. That's been a priority for folks. So let's go ahead and codify that, take it out of an executive order status. Let's focus on interior enforcement. We do have laws in this country. If we're going to have laws, we should enforce those laws. The chairman's bill, work with Chairman McCall, focuses on those issues. He also focuses on this ag issue that's been raised. He's been working with Mike Conaway, the chairman of the Ag Committee, to try to create a visa program that will be robust enough that American agriculture can continue to continue to thrive. And then he also goes after current immigration policy. Are we focused on skills, or are we not? Are we trying to grow the economy, or are we not? And those have he includes the 4 pillars that President Trump has, but he also goes beyond. One of the things he goes beyond, one of your callers mentioned earlier today, is mandatory E-Verify. That it's true that the problem isn't people who want to work. The problem is employers who want to game the system. Mandatory E-Verify would prevent employers from gaming the system. It's not in the president's proposal, as your caller mentioned earlier today. It is in the Goodlatte proposal that we'll be whipping today.
This is Richard in Woodbridge, Virginia, Republican line.
Yes, sir. I wanted to just go back to the discussion we were having about raising taxes on working class people to allocate to Social Security and these different things. Rand Paul just had a long speech about how we frivolously waste money into our military budget. Wouldn't it make more sense to just reallocate some of that money into the proper direction instead of raising taxes on working class people? I'll take my answer out there. Thank you.
Richard, 2 answers to that question. Really, the primary responsibility the Constitution gives the Congress is national security. So I would say that protecting and defending the nation is job 1. $700 billion is what Secretary of Defense General Mattis has asked for, told us that we need to stay safe in 2018 in a dangerous world. That's what Congress has provided. That's $100 billion lower than what was expected to be spent on national security when I got to Congress in 2011. So folks are absolutely taking a look at squeezing the defense budget as well. But Social Security is one of those programs that you pay into and then you pull back out of. And the short answer is the math was just wrong when the Social Security program got started. And so we overpromised and we're under-delivering. By 2032, Social Security Trust Fund isn't going to be able to meet its obligations. I think it's immoral to pull the rug out from under retirees today who are counting on those promises. But I think it's also immoral to ask young people to continue paying into a system that we know cannot meet the promises for that next generation. Again, that Social Security cap is north of $100,000. I know Woodbridge, Virginia is one of the highest earning counties in the nation. $100,000 in the great state of Georgia is a lot of money. So no one's talking about raising taxes on working class people. We're talking about raising the cap for folks who are not paying Social Security taxes north of about $120,000 a year in income.
Last call from Jerry in Alabama, Democrats line. Jerry, go ahead. You're on.
Those Alabamians that contribute quite heavily to the Georgia education system. And I wanted to ask you a question about your job as a congressman. Congress was frozen in 1912, had 435. Today, there's 435 members. Don't you think that representation would be much better if we had 1,200 members of Congress, maybe 500 senators, and have the senators responsible every 2 years instead of every 6 years? Make Congress accountable when they do things, and make them more accountable to their constituents instead of choosing who you want to represent. Let the represented choose their representatives.
Thank you, caller.
Jerry, thinking about the United States Senate, of course, that was part of the big compromise in the summer of 1787 between small states and big states, that every state would have the same number of representatives in the Senate. That 100 Senate number, I never hear anyone discussing changing that. I think that kind of cooling saucer of democracy is working as it was intended by our framers. You do hear that conversation in the House from time to time. We each have about 750,000 constituents today, and I understand the concern that folks are getting more and more disconnected from their constituency as their constituency gets larger and larger. The flip side of that is 435 members is a lot of members to manage. I don't believe if we had a 1,200-person Congress, it would be more effective. I actually think it would be less effective. It wouldn't be more functional. It would be more dysfunctional. We do want to find those ways to enhance representation. I couldn't tell you honestly that I believe tripling the number of members of Congress is going to move us in that direction.
Representative, being a Budget Committee member, do you think there's a future as far as running a government not under a CR, a continuing resolution, as we're currently doing?
Well, I really do. And in fact, as much as the last budget deal spent more money than I wanted to spend, that's what it bought us, is some certainty over the next 18 months. Shouldn't have to do a CR next time around. That's not the right way to run a government. But to Jerry's point about representation, we have a electorate today that seems to reward intransigence more than it rewards progress. And the question is, when the American voter decides that CRs are the wrong way to budget and we need longer budgeting, they'll make that clear to their members of Congress. I know we lose money every time we make a CR. It's a bad budgeting decision. But it seems that whether it's the media or whether it's the voter rewards those folks in the United States Senate who refuse to let any appropriations bills come forward. We used to do 12 a year. Now I don't believe they've done a single one in the 6 years I've been in Congress.
Representative Rob Woodall, Republican of Georgia, a member of the Budget and the Transportation and Infrastructure Committees. Thanks for joining us.
Pedro, thanks for having me today.
We will continue on in our discussions about transportation and infrastructure with a member, Representative John Garamendi, Democrat from California, also a member of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. That conversation coming up on Washington Journal.
This week.